King of Podcasts Radio Network proudly presents The Broadcasters Podcast, a weekly media commentary talking about traditional and digital media headlines and talking to the content creators out front and behind the scenes. Here is the King of Podcasts. Roughly 2.5 years producing and recording and hosting this program, and 175 episodes later, I get to go ahead and talk about a subject that I've been wanting to go ahead and focus on a sole program. With the way the news is right now with the media, this is a good time to go ahead and give a rant that I have been wanting to go and give for a long time, which it's a good time now as any. I have always detested the passage of the United States Telecommunications Act of 1996. I understand the reason why, but for a long time I really didn't understand. But I know what it did overall. And this is what I had the issue about, because of how much change the media landscape had. And it was because the act was a precursor, a legislative change, because of the impending impact that the internet was going to create on media. So they had to make things happen to create some new changes to incorporate the internet, because they knew, they were forward thinking, they realized something was going to happen going forward. So this is what I want to go and talk about here on the program tonight. The damage done. Now, the act was passed in February of 1996, but the 25th anniversary was then. I didn't bother to go ahead and talk about the anniversary then because it was just too much news at the time, and I just felt I was going to wait because we're already here in the 25th anniversary. A milestone. And honestly, I think if this act never got passed, then some of the things of media deregulation that came as a result of this act, this program probably never really needed to go ahead and exist, because a lot of things would have happened. I don't know if podcasting would be a thing. I don't know. I would think radio would be much more competitive. And I think network and cable television and movies, there will be a lot more competition, a lot more companies vying, large and small, but we would have a real kaleidoscope of content out there and loads of room for creativity. But it's not like that now. And it took 25 years to get to where we are now. And it was only about 15 years ago or so, really with the advent of the iPhone and the iPod, did we really start seeing the digital disruption. When broadband was made available, where you had broadband speeds good enough to go ahead and listen to streaming audio or watch streaming video, especially when you can get it to your phone or to any whatever remote device you want. That was the game that changed for all of us, because that's what really created a new thing, because the Telecommunications Act of 1996 changed the game. The playing field was changed. So just like those that might not want to play in the stock market right now because you're tired of being in a bloodbath every day, you go to crypto. It's the same idea. The internet has always become the new rebellious option, the new Wild West, until that gets regulated. But for now, I don't believe it'll stay like that. And I'm hoping for that for the most part. So it was enacted into law on February 8th, 1996 by President Bill Clinton. It represented the beginning of a new era in telecommunications regulation in the United States, the most significant and extensive change governing communications since the act was enacted, the original Communications Act in 1934. The passage represented a bipartisan consensus. So at this time, without looking at the ramifications, Congress at that point, in a bipartisan effort, looked at advances in technology and the success of regulatory models based on competition rather than monopoly, called for major changes in the regulation of telecommunication. President Clinton, when he signed the bill, he said, quote, "The law is truly revolutionary legislation that will bring the future to our doorstep. In my way of thinking, it really embodies what we ought to be about as a country and what we ought to be about in this city. It clearly enables the age of possibility in America to expand to include more Americans. It will create many, many high-wage jobs. It will provide for more information and more entertainment to virtually every home. It embodies our best values by supporting market reforms as well as the V-chip. And it brings us together, and it was passed by people coming together." So when I look at that quote and I say to myself, provide more information and more entertainment. Now, I don't know if he was thinking about the fact that we were going to have the internet become the major part, but I don't know if it was. But they understood what this meant. Some of the transactions are directly attributable to regulatory changes affected by this act. Others are more likely a reflection of firms' attempts to prepare themselves for the more competitive market environment that will respond by full implementation, the increasing convergence of services and markets, and the continuing globalization of economic markets. Now, part of this had to do with the phone industry and the way that things were being changed, but the real underlying issue that came in was the ownership limits. Broadcast services, which is a part of the Act. There were originally restrictions on the ownership of broadcast stations in order to protect localism and the diversity of voices reaching people through the media. But what needed to be understood was there were restrictions on the ownership of broadcast stations because it actually fostered diversity of voices reaching people through the media. Because then you could not monopolize the market having so many different stations out there where you had individual local station owners. Now, if one could not continue to hold on to the license nor the station itself, sold out to somebody else. But at least you would have a free market system to have these stations owned and operated in some way, shape, or form. Because then what happened is, how many of the stations do we know of that are either Spanish-owned, black-owned, or they were geared towards Spanish listeners, or Hispanic, Black, Asian, Indian, picket? How many of those are out there that were able to go ahead and access, a VHF, a UHF channel, or an FM or AM radio signal, and the ability to be able to do that? Or even have a channel that would be accessible on cable television and then access to different cable systems. It increased the national audience reach for television station ownership to 35% from 25%. And the FCC conducted a rulemaking whether local TV ownership limitations should be modified or eliminated, and that the FCC's network cable cross ownership rule and statutory broadcast station cable cross ownership restriction, but retaining a regulatory broadcast cable and broadcast newspaper ownership bans. But you open the door with this act to create deregulation. And all you did was allow big companies, in a way, what happened was, it wasn't even so much the bigger companies accessing, it's that there were people that were opportunists that said, we're going to just gobble up radio stations and then we're going to sell them. Because the rules were changed. One of the people very responsible for this was Lowell Bud Paxton, who bought a number of radio stations immediately. He just went on a bargaining spree, shopping away for stations, selling off his stations to Clear Channel Communications and the Mays family, and making a big win profit, because he did that investment of these radio stations, which he did not care about. He bought them to sell them off to go ahead and create Pax TV, his broadcast network. He wanted to have his own TV station because he actually had the home shopping network. Didn't want to create his own programming, so he did this in order to benefit himself. Now, I can't knock him for doing that, but it's the rule and the change of the rule that caused this to happen. And then you had other organizations that were kind of struggling, and they decided we're going to take a payday. If somebody's out there willing to go and buy us out, we're going to do that. So AM/FM radio networks, Chancellor Media, Group Westinghouse, Citadel Broadcasting, part of ABC, J-Core Communications, Chancellor Media, so many others. They all decided, you know what? We're going to sell out to the bidders. We're going to get out. And so some people decided we're just going to go and sell the stations off, do something else. Take the payday. And that's what happened. And as I said, a number of things happened as a result. Let's go ahead and scroll all the way up to April 1st, 2021. Now, if I talked about this particular act and the 25th anniversary then, we wouldn't be able to talk about what's been going on now when it comes to a project, the Prometheus Radio project. I've talked about it here on this show, which was hoping to basically repeal what the Telecommunications Act of 1996 created, as much as they could with all the damage that was already done. Now, one of them was, again, the FCC versus the Prometheus Radio project. This was presented to the Supreme Court. It was the authority that the FCC possesses broad statutory authority to regulate broadcast media in the public interest, under which it has promulgated strict ownership rules limiting the number of radio stations, TV stations, and newspapers that a single entity may own in a given market. And that there was a rule that every 4 years that the FCC had to review those rules, repeal or modify any ownership rules that the FCC determines are no longer in the public interest. The FCC failed us because they never enacted any changes, nor did they ever follow up as said here. Since 2002, the FCC sought to change several of its ownership rules. Each time, the Third Circuit rejected those efforts as unlawful under the Administrative Procedure Act. Now, they would do things, but again, that wasn't to help to serve the public interest. It was the opposite. The FCC concluded in 2017 3 of its ownership rules no longer serve the public interest, repealing the newspaper broadcast cross-ownership rule, the radio-TV cross-ownership rule, and to modify the local TV ownership rule. So a lot of local TV stations owned by big companies, which is why your local news is the way it is now. Your local newspapers, there's so much national global content, it's nothing local about it. When corporate, big companies come in, they're not looking for the public interest, the local public interest, the public interest that was originally initiated by that station or that newspaper or that period. Prometheus Radio Project said that the FCC's decision was arbitrary and capricious under the APA, arguing on the basis the record evidence did not support the FCC's judgment regarding the effects on minority and female ownership. So the Prometheus Radio Project came in on a different tangent because they were looking to foster diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in a way, I'm glad that that was brought upon because I think that is a medium that could definitely benefit from having some inclusion. But I don't want it to be where it is forced upon by big companies. We can have this happen where we can have ownership opportunities, not content opportunities, but ownership opportunities. When you have a particular organization, cause, or effort, if that is being controlled, managed, operated, and owned by said company, it's different than having somebody offer the airtime where it has to be a certain way and put together, and it's then not going to serve the public interest. Just saying. So with that said, deregulation, and this is not anything I'm going to say throughout any party lines or any political aspects. I don't like it, period. Deregulation I've not been happy about. Now, the decision, ultimately, the court restored the FCC's order on reconsideration to repeal or modify the ownership rules I just mentioned. So they shot down the Prometheus Radio Project's plan. Now, in the background, let's make this point. With respect to the 3 rules at issue in Prometheus, The local television rule was adopted in 1964, radio TV cross-ownership 1970, newspaper broadcast cross-ownership 1975. In 1996, in response to the disruptive effect of cable networks and the internet. So it was not just the internet, but it was also cable as a disruption. And as a protective measure, the government intervened to help major corporate media. That's what they did, whether good or bad. My thing is the Supreme Court didn't help out at all. I don't know why there is no restriction at all. I'm probably in the minority on this. I mean, big business, if they can outbuy anybody else, I guess that's the way it is. But it's not helped in the way of creativity. It has not helped us out when it comes to where the radio landscape was when I grew up. Before I got into radio, as I was in college, everything changed. When I think of some of the big radio stations that are on the air and the legacies they have going back 20, 30, 40 years, when they were independently owned or they were owned by one owner that might have had another radio station, 2 or 4 stations. They might have had 2 AMs and 2 FMs. And what happened was that you had these owners and they still had real control over their content. And they still had an attachment to their audience. And they would provide specific audiences with the content they wanted that fit the local market. Great example is PBS. PBS, even though it was a larger entity as a network, but these stations that were owned, when you look at the kind of programming we had from local PBS stations making their own programming that became national, the same thing happened over here. Because you would have shows that might have worked in a local aspect that would then get expanded on to a national platform. Phil Donahue fit that mold. Oprah Winfrey fit that mold. You think of all the different kids shows that were out there that got noticed as a result. I mean, stations had their own individuality, their own identity. And that's what's missing now altogether, is that there are no identities for any of these stations. Television or radio or the like. Those days are gone. Now, there should have been a way to have content be in a national or global sense, and then these stations are providing out to them. But to give these big corporations, to say like an AT&T or a Comcast, to give them the opportunity to go and obtain so much and be able to go ahead and create such a media conglomerate, like a Disney in the same way, to be able to go and buy so many different stations. When you think about Disney, they actually had ABC Radio, they had Disney's the Radio Disney programming, and at Cumulus, which was underneath ABC as well, and Citadel, and all those stations underneath at one point. CBS, Infinity Broadcasting, all those stations underneath them, and so on and so forth. And what ultimately happened, when I look at Clear Channel now iHeartMedia, the deregulation, if they were able to go ahead and be successful and continue to make money off their stations, that would be one thing. But they don't. In their time, the quick rise to acquire radio stations put them in debt. And they continue to stay in debt. And they've been allowed to stay in debt. Radio has not helped at all. And radio is basically just an underling, because I don't even know why an iHeartMedia even owns these stations for. Or PBS for that same matter. Why they have to hold on to all these radio stations. Because we know that both of those outlets are now focusing on podcasting. They nationalize their programming. They syndicate so much programming that doesn't even fit the market they're in. They have alienated their audience. The chance to even bring in a younger audience. If you Was it that radio just decided we're just going to give up on trying to compete with Spotify and Pandora and Apple? Are we just going to give up? Are we going to give up on satellite radio? Are we just going to give up the fight? Instead of competition, they capitulated. They gave in. And now radio is this mess where there are some good local radio programmers because some of the rules the FCC's put on board when it comes to FM translators or low power FMs have helped. But that's just not enough. We've never had a real issue because people that own the media, the radio airwaves are owned by the people. But nobody really thinks about that. Television and cable, you have to realize our cable bills are so high because of the fact that we have so many stations that are no longer independently owned and operated. They're all clumped together by the top 5 media companies in the country. So what are you going to do? It was an abuse of power, an abuse of deregulation. And the other thing, too, is that you have to look at the danger of having a company owning a large number of newspapers, radio stations, TV stations, websites, period. And if you don't have anybody at the top that's saying, listen, creativity rules, we need to make sure we continue to put out good content. Look, there were big corporations like CBS, NBC, ABC that could do network programming, and they were competing with each other, and they were putting out good content. And they had real programmers, people that had a real understanding of what to deliver to an audience. A wide-ranging audience. Deregulation segmented the audience. So we didn't have that wide range of content. Then we started getting, everything started becoming segregated. There's a story that is really fascinating that came from Vice.com that really does explain some of the casualties that we've gotten as a result of this. This story, you know, the point they're trying to make here, I can appreciate it, and I want to bring that up here. This is from a couple months ago, but the story was labeled, this 1996 law was meant to save radio. Instead, it decimated popular black music. This is from Brian Joseph. This is back from October 2020. Now, they mentioned the station KJLH, which I believe that was Stevie Wonder to own that station at one point. In Los Angeles, home to about 10 million black people. The lineup pulls from Billboard's weekly adult R&B national airplay chart, featuring newer songs from artists a little past their prime, targeted 25 to 54-year-olds. It's the only independent terrestrial commercial radio station serving a black music audience in California's major markets. Its peer KTWV is one of the 235 radio stations owned by Entercom, which originally was CBS Radio or Infinity. A Utah corporation named Bonneville International owns San Francisco's 41-year-old KBLX, along with 13 other stations. KGLH relies on the revenue from ads in various events. 2 streams dried out by COVID-19, while its peers rest atop bags of corporate money. Karen Slade, VP and General Manager at KJLH, says, quote, where we may have been competing one-on-one or two-on-one, now in LA, you can be competing with as many as 7 or 8 stations owned by the same entity. Then you're competing for audience and advertising dollars. They make it just so much harder to compete in the market because they tend to have a lot of efficiencies because of their financial structure. The station will be an anomaly regardless of what time zone it was in, thanks to the Telecommunications Act of 1996. Its stated purpose was to promote competition, and if we are judging laws by stated purposes, it's failed. Absolutely correct. Bonneville International, the now defunct Infinity Broadcasting and Clear Channel, dominated the market, collecting about 68% of the ad dollars while crippling the diversity of airwaves nationwide. And that took very little time for that to happen. Roughly took about 5 to 10 years to completely change the entire landscape of radio. Let me read that portion again. 3 years. So before the start of the millennium, those three companies dominated 68% of ad dollars. Cheap ad dollars. Because then all these stations would take the ad dollars and they would go ahead and offer, hey, we could put you on all these different stations. Dollar a holler. MS Communications CEO Jeffrey Simulian told the Chicago Tribune in 2001, I think the act has taken some of the localism out of radio. Ultimately, there may be a backlash. It's very hard for us to be arbiters. This is a great quote. It's very hard for us to be arbiters of taste, especially when we're responsible to shareholders. The act didn't just disrupt black radio. It's an industry-wide contortion that made classic rock fans blamed for making people think Jay-Z is good. But the music business is like every other American business in how it denies black people capital. The law at least help instate other roadblocks. Now, there was said to be not too much of a negative impact on black radio ownership. Black or majority-owned AM and FM stations make up 2.4% of the market. Today. Before the act, it was 1.6%. In the 2 decades since, DJs and personalities started to resemble figureheads instead of gatekeepers. What gets played on the radio rests in the hands of advertisers and playlists mandated by the few corporations who own them. There's a lot of repetition among the dozens of black radio stations at iHeartMedia and its predominantly white board of directors oversee, flattening the music's regional characteristics to fit under one ad-friendly umbrella. And that's not just black radio. That's also Spanish radio. That's also other genres, other formats. Pop, alternative. We used to have a burgeoning rock format. Now, the rock industry, the rock music industry would not be dead as it is today if it still had consistent radio. If not every radio station resulted to be classic or album-oriented rock. Living in the 90s, 80s, 70s, 60s. Living in the past. Because that's all they can do. Now, there are some stations that are playing some new artists, but without the ability to be out there. I listened to an interview, it was about 4 hours long, that Shadow Stevens did. Shadow Stevens, by the way, you know, he was originally a host, and he replaced Casey Kasem on America Top 40. He was also known as one of the members on Hollywood Squares as the announcer on the show. But what I never knew about him was the work that he did as a radio DJ for 20 plus years. Working at some amazing radio stations, WRKO in Boston, KHJ Los Angeles, and ultimately going to start up K-Rock, KROQ Los Angeles. Ultimately, the major modern rock station that was brought today, that came out of the whole change of progressive rock, the freeform format that we had back years ago, back in the 70s and 80s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And that was real. It was diversity, it was change, it was creativity. We were discovering new artists, we were discovering new music all the time. It was a different time. A communications study professor at Morgan State University, Jared Ball, he said, quote, what we've noticed since the 1990s is that this consolidation of commercial media ownership has allowed for an increasingly smaller number of people to impact what forms of black cultural production become popular and then be disseminated back to black audiences here and around the world. Keep in mind what he said right there. When you think about all the programming that is directed towards the black community, who's really running that? Now, we're always hearing now more that we have, you know, people that are more understanding to go ahead and create programming that fits more of what the community wants to, is entertained by. But now we're not even getting that so much, because now the entertainment that goes towards the black community in some cases is being focused at them in more of an educational, informative sense to retrain them. Remember, it's not so much entertainment as it is just something else that's different. In a 2020 study, Nielsen reported that 91% of black adults 18 and older still listen to radio on a weekly basis. Now, part of the reason why is because there are some stations that are owned and operated by the big radio companies. Absolutely. But then there are some smaller ownership of stations out there as well. Now, not all of them. Cox Radio is a pretty big company, but down here in Miami, Cox Radio owns 99 Jams and Hot 105, are two predominantly black radio stations here in the market. And if I'm right, WBLS is still operated not by a larger company, but they're also a station that was very significantly different in the style of music they did whatsoever. A different style, different time. But then with them, their station is not, that station actually is still not owned by a large station. It's not run by a large company that runs that station. And there are still some stations out there that still serve the market that are not under a large corporate umbrella. But iHeartMedia has a number of urban properties. But what's happened is that some of these stations, and I think this is what's very important, is that some of these stations, they still had ownership, or they still had people that were within the company that were able to go and continue the hold on making sure they were able to program properly for the community. If certain community programming needed to be on, if these urban stations wanted to have gospel programming, they could do that. If they wanted to have public affairs programming, they would do that as well. Because I can tell you what, in Miami, the two stations here, Hot 105 and 99 Jams, Jerry Russian, originally owned and operated the stations, he's still a driving force for those stations. Same thing goes for other markets where they have management or they have executives on staff that were there prior to the corporatization, before they got brought out. Larry Miller, director of the NYU Music Business Program at NYU Steinhardt. He says, quote, "I don't want to understate the importance of giving listeners context around what's important and what's happening now, which is hard unless you get a lean-forward listener listening to the hippest playlists. For the average listener, they need and want context. It's wishful thinking to believe amending the act could salvage the radio landscape." And this is not too far off where the ownership numbers are right now. iHeartMedia owns 855 stations. They actually owned over 1,000 at one point. Cumulus Media, 445. Town Square Media, 321. Breaking up these conglomerates would cause a web of financial insolvencies and litigation that would likely cause too much harm to justify a small chance of regaining a platform capable of finding the next big thing. But in its pivot to the newer taste-waking frontier of streaming playlists, the music industry might have just found a mirror of corporate radio. A song getting skipped over and consequently moved lower down or removed from a playlist is analogous to a radio program director being forced to drop a record from rotation. The muscle of a record label is just as potent in apps too. But remember, in radio, nobody even cares anymore, because the record labels don't even service radio anymore. They're taking their promotions departments and focusing them towards streaming, because that's where they got to go. They have big teams who do nothing but maintain relationships with the people who are choosing which tracks appear on which order on which playlist. Now, Ball also said that, quote, "What is important to take from the Telecom Act of 96 is the process that it set in motion as it relates to popular culture, music in particular. And that's what needs to be revisited. Who controls the popularity and who controls the wealth that's being created from what's made popular? And that's what needs to be targeted with whatever particular legislation we want to focus on." There's a lot to be said in that article. Again, you can look for this article in the show notes at broadcasterspodcast.com. You can look at it for yourselves. Now, back in February, when we did have the 25th anniversary, there was an article that talked about modernizing the act. I want to take a few things that did bring up on this. Now, in this story from RealClearMarkets.com, they recommend a Digital Age Communications Act. So they think, let's do another piece of legislation, which I don't trust. However well-intentioned the deregulatory exhortations of the 1996 Act's framers, from the beginning there was a disconnect between its proclaimed deregulatory purpose and the framework established for achieving that purpose. The ink was not long dry from the signing ceremony before it became clear that the law could not easily accommodate the accelerating transition from the analog age narrowband communications marketplace characterized by old-fashioned voice telephony to the digital age broadband marketplace characterized by the dynamic, ever-evolving internet. By December 2000, SEC Commissioner, soon-to-be SEC Chairman Michael Powell, was urging policymakers to focus on what he called a great digital broadband migration. He said that computer systems working in parity with communications have spawned the internet and the advanced networks we see today that fully integrate satellites, telephones, wireless devices, broadcasting and cable over fiber optic, broadband and wireless networks, what we now call convergence. It means that digital communications delivered over rapidly emerging broadband networks were on the cusp of rendering obsolete the existing regulatory classifications embedded in the 1996 Act. So we've had so much change for this to not have stayed around. Now, this is a different story, but for me, it is the deregulation that really is the ultimate part. But if they did come back and talked about it. Now, we could also talk about an example right now of this very thing continuing to happen, deregulation. We can go ahead and talk about now how we're not getting another deal. Another merging of two major media companies. I don't even know how they're going to make this happen, but we now see about how WarnerMedia is going to be merging with Discovery Networks. So I want to bring that story up real quick. It's from TheRinger.com. They talked about this a couple days ago. And I also brought this up on my Wrestling is Real podcast because this was important for one of the wrestling promotions, AEW, to be involved in this as well. So it was a $43 billion deal announced Monday as a U-turn for AT&T, which acquired Time Warner in 2018 for $85 billion. So AT&T thought a phone company would get to gain control of HBO, CNN, Warner Brothers, TBS, DC Comics, and several other iconic mass media brands. And the new division overseeing was dubbed WarnerMedia, which launched the streaming service HBO Max to house all that content. So far, HBO Max has done well. It's been relatively successful. But now AT&T has a lot of issues. They're taking on lots of debt to buy Time Warner. Now they're trying to build up their nationwide 5G coverage for their phone service and fiber optic networks, given that, it's a phone company. So they decided they're going to spin off its content arm and form a new media company with Discovery, which marks a pretty fortunate reversal. The company that emerges once the WarnerMedia-Discovery deal closes in 2022 will have a vast and compelling catalog that can not only compete with Netflix and Disney, but beat them. More of the effects of deregulation even happening today. So look at what you're going to have in this new company. HBO, the blockbuster film franchises of Warner Brothers, DC, the cultural niches of Cartoon Network, Adult Swim and Cinemax, CNN, TBS, TNT, and then the Discovery end, which is a plethora of unscripted and reality content from HGTV, Food Network, TLC, Oprah Winfrey Network, Animal Planet, and Discovery Channel. No other company can package this much content. Netflix made strides in reality television but lacks sports. Disney covers kids with animation and even Hulu and ESPN in its empire, but it's short on reality series. Amazon's establishing itself as a respectable film and TV distributor, but doesn't do news. This would be one of the deepest libraries in the world with nearly 200,000 hours of iconic programming and 100 brands. More than 100 brands. It's so big. And it's going to be consolidated. We're going to go through another corporatization. As we know with the pandemic, look at how many people lost jobs. Programmers, executives that were still doing things good to try to create good quality programming. But then, as these companies become downsized, and it's more about the platform than it is the people creating the content for the platform, and the fact that the content is being controlled internally instead of getting shopped around other content by other studios, they're doing it on their own. They're going to try to make it as cheap as they can, and they're going to try to make as much money as they can. That's going to take up a large number of media that's going to be out there for people to go after. It might be another great streaming service, absolutely. And who knows what this deal is going to really do when it comes to cable. Because a platform put together with WarnerMedia-Discovery combined, if they do this, cable gets destroyed. Because this could be the thing that would ultimately remove the need for cable ultimately. This could destroy cable television. It will be gone. If they find a way to localize it, local TV will be dead. Network TV will be dead. So keep that all in mind. Are Netflix, Disney, Amazon, and company powerless to compete against this new media giant? Not at all. They have the advantage of existing first. Despite ceding ground to an upstart Disney Plus, Netflix still has the most subscribers out of any streaming service. Disney's the biggest media company in the world. Amazon is one of the biggest companies in the world, period. But any company that can offer consumers access to Batman, Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, Diners, Drivers, and Dives, the NBA, Anderson Cooper, the Property Brothers, and so on, will be a serious threat to those existing services and of serious interest to viewers. Would not be possible if not for deregulation. Allowing the control of almost all the mass media to only a handful of companies. And that's it. Which is why the internet is where you want to be. Social media is where it is. Where you can find individual, independent content, entertainment. That's why I watch more TikTok than I ever have before. Very easy to watch an hour long of TikTok spread out throughout the day. Instead of me flipping on my television set? No, not so much. These are the kind of things that have to be considered about how far they're getting with all this. And there's obviously a lot more I could talk about this. Because I think about how everybody wants to be able to go ahead and we all want to be able to do something, and we have the opportunities to use podcasting as a way to go ahead and broadcast to other people. A lot of people have like the appreciation of being able to do broadcasting. It's a comfort from home. The equipment is available. And if you have good content, you get a chance to go out there and shine. And it's great. I would never have the opportunity to do this program if not for podcasting. Because think about it now. If we did not have the internet, if we were subjected to only have the programming that's out there for us, whereas the content that celebrities provide, and maybe we don't care what the celebrities are doing outside of them making movies or doing TV shows. But it's obvious that the efforts made to make money on these media properties continues to make these companies suffer. Because now a Disney, an Amazon, so Disney has so many different channels. They're working on Disney Plus, but then they have Disney Channel, Disney XD. They have ABC as ABC Family, or now it's called Freeform. They have the ESPN channels. And all those channels, there's only so much meaning behind them now, only so much of an audience that still watches them in the first place. ABC Television Network in general. So these particular properties are just anchors now. So these companies are allowed to go and have different sectors that are going to be underperforming because they're now all focusing on streaming. They have to go ahead and compete against the internet. Because what if we'd had some of these underperforming entities that are being swallowed up by these corporations? What if they were allowed to be sold off? If they were forced to be divested? What if that were the case, that happened? Somebody else had the opportunity to take a channel, take access on the cable system, or have a chance to go and broadcast on the TV spectrum, whether it was a VHF channel, or FM and AM. If they had opportunities for people to go ahead and hit a large audience without having to go to broadcasting through the internet, where you go ahead and reach people through social media or through a webcast or a podcast. What if you could still have that brick and mortar structure? Which at the least, maybe you're not necessarily worrying about the audience that you have out there, but those stations still have resources. They still have studios. They still have equipment. There are still things there, the wherewithal, the resources to create really large quality content. And that can be used. But they're not allowed to be taken up. Imagine if you had some of the people out there that had the chance to go and take an MTV. If MTV could be divested off, and then you could have somebody come on board and create a new era of music programming. And VH1 was the same way. Two music networks that really did change a lot of things for us. MTV was critical in the positioning of music and popular culture. They were one of the catalysts of popular culture. If MTV were what it should be today, it would be how TikTok is run. TikTok would fuel an MTV. If TikTok were able to go and be picked up, and the type of people that are on TikTok were able to move themselves over to MTV, get rid of ridiculousness being run 20 hours a day, could you imagine? I could. But more importantly, when we talk about diversity of voices and the competition, it's not as if these corporations really care about the radio stations. Because some of these corporations, they're run by private equity ownership. That's what iHeartMedia is. It's run by a private equity firm. So they're just holding on to these stations basically as collateral. And they're living off the interest of being able to go ahead and obtain all these stations, not without any regard of caring how the programming is done in the public interest. No, they just care about making money, but they don't care about making money in the traditional sense. They'd rather make money in this private equity sense, where we could just make money off the interest, and whenever they have to go and divest and divulge it, they can. And they're allowed to be able to get away with running these large companies with mounting debt. Large amounts of debt. Now, iHeartMedia is still allowed to go and be able to operate and not have to split their content up. So if the podcasting arm, the outdoor advertising arm, the concert arm were not split up into individual companies. You know there will be other people that would run those companies, and then you would have a better live music industry. You would have probably a better outdoor advertising aspect. You'd probably have better radio stations. What you can't do now is get rid of deregulation, but you can have the FCC come in and judge on monopolies and antitrust and be able to say, okay, we need to break some companies up. They were doing that. They were going to do that to Google and Microsoft and Apple and all that. They were considering these kind of things, or Facebook. But if you could do that, it would help open the playing field. There'll be more people to have more opportunities to do media. And so you could have the mass media do content their way, but then you'd have the alternative, the grassroots that will do their content that would serve a different public. That would be nice. But they don't want to do that. I don't know. I wish there was a better way. and I don't know what's going to happen next. Interesting story from Lee Abrams. He actually brought up some content. He gave us some comments on his website about where he sees media going forward. So only going to pull that story up. He talked about where the media is going to be in 5 years. So he has a new website, LeeAbramsMediaVisions.com. And on his blog, he has a lot of things he's bringing up. So media predictions for 2026. Some of this scares me. He gives 11 predictions for media 5 years from now as the new Wild West gets wilder, fueled by the ongoing technology explosion. Newspapers. 4 or 5 will prevail as national brands, and local papers will be supported by contributions, grants, and possibly government funding. Smaller markets may survive as scaled-back, free, and highly condensed editions. Medium and larger markets, not so without public funds or decimated output. FM radio demographics will continue to skew older. A handful of under 50 powerhouses will prevail, as will smaller market, extremely localized stations. Generic radio will be omnipresent, with some marginal successes, but generally in clear decline. Do you hear what he's saying? Homogenized. Generic radio. No personality whatsoever. Streaming music will clearly become the dominant norm among younger demos, favoring personal choice with no historical allegiance to FM, and will explode 50 plus once the high circulation services provide new takes on FM radio's natural audience that provide more character and curation than the jukebox effect provides, while utilizing the new listening technologies. Podcasting will continue to develop as the modern day talk radio. There will be an extreme shakeout as existing and emerging big names will dominate and create long-term pod brands. Medium players may make money, most won't. Small players will fade out. Expect increased production values that will colorize the presentations, creating a theater of the mind environment to elevate creative. Satellite radio will continue steady growth, fueled by next generation's car audio, unification with other big media, and carriage of compelling brands and talent. Streaming TV, more niche programming shows and channels to complement movies. Existing niches and series as the media becomes dominant. News will migrate to devices. Continues with some radical non-TV news rooted concepts emerging. And this existing style of news will continue to age itself out of dominance, credibility, and relevance, regardless of the platform it's delivered on. And somebody actually said that, I was thinking about the other day, because now we just have an abundance of information. So we don't need the news to be reported the way it has been. So news isn't important anymore. We just need access to the information. Like we do a book, a website. Just give us the information. We don't need anybody to interpret the news for us, nor give their opinion or bias to it. And that's something we should actually consider more. Live music events. Expect a revolution in large-scale live events driven by extreme advances in audio and visual technology applied to a live environment. Social media. The big players stay big with more than a little pollution from misinformation, socio-political division, and conspiracy theories, while 1 or 2 new concepts enter the mix with great success among many failures. And big media consolidation will be slow to react, but will begin to aggressively seek new programming ideas for differentiation and growth, some of which will gain traction. Though they will remain bulky and less an agile and fast response to the pulse of the street, opting to acquire fast-moving upstarts to their portfolios in significant numbers. An exciting age-rebel content creators to find big homes. Radical new thinkers will be engaged by the smartest of the mega media to their competitive advantage. So the big corporate conglomerates will then just go and acquire companies smaller end that might be able to go and help them out. They will not be the answer. They will seek out the answer. So there's a space for that. A whole lot of answers. But all I know is that as I record this show, I'm still disappointed. And even though I brought this story up today and I focused on it, I don't feel any better talking about it. It just makes me feel bad. And it's not like this everywhere else around the world. I don't know why America makes it so tough, but they do. Okay, that's my hour for tonight, and I appreciate all of you checking in, listening to the show like you do. I hope you'll come back for another show next week. We'll definitely get into some current content. Of course, remember to go ahead and check out my When I'm Not Podcasting series. If there's certain programming, some stories that I don't bring up over on the Broadcasters Podcast, I'll bring them up over on When I'm Not Podcasting. Kind of an overfill, if you will, of stories that I did not have time to cover tonight. Or unless I decide to roll them over to next week. But we'll leave till next week. Remember, until next week, content is king, and control of your content is in your hands.
Thank you for listening to the Broadcasters Podcast. Find all the links to subscribe to the show by going to broadcasterspodcast.com. And don't forget to check out the King of Podcasts wrestling program, the Wrestling is Real podcast, exclusively at wrestlingisreal.com.